Starting. Hello, everybody. This is Franchesca from the Educator's Room, and we are here with Jonathan Pelto from Wait What. Hello, Jonathan. How are you?
I am very well. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this.
Well, thank you for joining us. We are so excited. This is our first masterclass for our Education Journalism Fellowship. We have about 30 teachers who are interested in really taking their professional learning by the horns and learning about what they want to learn about. So if you give us a second, tell us a little bit about you and about your site and all those good things.
Sure. So I am in Connecticut, and for those outside of the United States, that is just northeast of New York. New York City is the state of Connecticut, and in the state of Connecticut, I'm in the upper northeast corner where the University of Connecticut is. I grew up in this area. My folks were both faculty members at the University of Connecticut, and I ran for the Connecticut legislature, the Connecticut House of Representatives, when I was just finishing up a senior at the University of Connecticut. And won, and became at that point the youngest member of the Connecticut General Assembly. I served for 10 years and made it up to the number 3 spot in the House, and was at that point thinking, or up until then, was thinking that I'd have a career in politics. But my first daughter was born, and I realized that politics is really not conducive to family life. So I left the legislature and started a public relations company that focused on helping people advocate for causes, particularly more progressive, left of center causes. So my clients included unions and education groups and human service groups and all environmental groups. And I did that for about 17 years. And then my third career, I started in 2010. So this is my 6th year of being a blogger or a citizen journalist, an advocacy journalist. They're called a lot of different things. And there's some tension between quote unquote real journalism and what we do. I am an education blogger. That is, that I focus primarily on education issues, although my blog, which is called Wait What? Wait, what? Focuses in on education and then the politics of my state. But I also serve as the founder and coordinator for what's called the Education Bloggers Network. And I'm sure many of your teachers know Diane Ravitch and her work. She is the patron saint of the education bloggers. I started working with her just about 6 years ago at the beginning of this process, and realized that there were a whole bunch of people out there that were doing this kind of work. And that is, they were reporting on education issues at the local level, the district level, the school level, the state level, the national level, but they were sort of off on their own. And so we created what we call the Education Bloggers Network, as an informal group of about almost 250 bloggers from around the country. We have a couple in Canada who blog on a regular basis about education, and we share ideas. We call ourselves the equivalent for any teachers who are history teachers, the committees of correspondence. Just before the American Revolution, there were a bunch of people who were doing the kinds of stuff that we do, sort of grassroots reporting. At that time, of course, it was kind of dangerous because they were reporting on the desire to separate from England. And so they created what was called the Committees of Correspondence, in which they worked individually and in groups and across the colonies in communicating and in sharing ideas on how to get the American people ready for the American Revolution. So in some respects, we're doing the same thing, and that is we consider ourselves reporters. We abide by many of the basic ethical standards of reporters, and that is, we want to do fact-based, but we're also not afraid of hiding our beliefs, which is why reporters would say that they would claim that a true reporter is objective and has no viewpoint whatsoever. I believe that that's really not true anymore, and one need only look at the mass media to see that, whether it's Fox News or MSNBC or even something like CNN. I heard an interview the other day with a CNN reporter who was saying that because he was quote unquote objective, he didn't want to challenge Trump when Trump lied, and because challenging him would remove his objectivity. Well, in my mind, if you don't challenge somebody who's lying, that means that you are not being objective. That objective is challenging that person. So, so what we do is we believe in public education. We believe in students and teachers and the role of education in being the tools that people need to live more fulfilling and productive lives. And many of us have a pretty strong agenda, but we also see ourselves as simply reporters that are reporting on what's going on around us. So my blog is 6 years old. I've had a couple million hits. I usually do about 3,000 hits a day. I focus primarily on my state and the state of Connecticut, but as I said, we have bloggers that blog every day, like myself, versus those that blog maybe once a week or even once every few weeks. Diane Ravitch, hers is the lead blog. She gets about 40,000 hits a day. And has had, since she opened up her blog, she's had 27 million hits. So it's in a different league, and she does really is she does looks at what people are blogging about, and she uses our blogs and then reblogs them with her own commentary. And so I thought I would just very briefly tell you, and be happy to talk about any of these issues in more detail, but I find, and I think most of the education bloggers find, that about a third of our stories come from stories that are in the news that we either don't think have been reported accurately, or even if they have been reported accurately, there's additional information that we want to get out to our readers. So about a third of our material, a third of my material, comes from what's already in the news. About a third of it comes from things that are taking place in other parts of the country. And so I then want to talk about it here in my state, and how does it apply. And so that is taking somebody else's, not their work, but their ideas of what it is that they focused on. Let's say in the charter school field, let's say that it is that most charter schools, for example, don't take their fair share of students that have special education needs, those that are English language learners, and they have very effective systems at getting rid of students who have behavioral issues. And so then they brag about how good their test scores are, but in fact, they no longer represent the general population. They have cherry-picked a small subgroup of people. So let's say there's a report in Ohio. What I may do is take that report and then collect the data in Connecticut, and then report on that. So part of it is somebody else's reporting, and part of it is my own research and reporting. And then the last third comes from what I would call, or in the business they call, enterprise stories. That is stories that you really start from scratch, and you do all of the research. And usually those take more heavy lifting, more research, and I can talk a little bit about where you do research, but there's lots and lots of online sources of information, both the data and also looking at whether other people have already written about it. So usually about a third of my stories come from that kind of a thing. As I said, the all kinds of techniques about doing stories, and then all kinds of techniques for getting readers to read your stories. And so a journalist traditionally is working for a television station or a newspaper. They only have to be a journalist. They only have to do their story. We bloggers are not only writing stories and researching stories, but we're also building an audience. And so one of the things, for example, this Education Bloggers Network does is it trains our bloggers on how to build their audience. So when I hear people say, I want to cover an issue like education, first off, I applaud that. When I was a legislator, we have a number of newspapers in the state of Connecticut, but we have one with the newspaper of record. It's called the Hartford Courant. It's the oldest continuously running newspaper in the United States, and it would cover the legislature. And when the legislature was in session, it would have maybe 7 reporters and then 3 or 4 part-time reporters who covered specific topics like education. Now they have 1 reporter and then a couple of part-time that help covered during the legislative session. So the major newspaper in the state of Connecticut has gone from having maybe 12 reporters covering the legislature down to 1.5, 2 reporters covering the legislature. So there's a lot less information out there now than there was 30 years ago. And that's particularly true in education, because education has always been seen as a relatively unimportant beat for newspapers or television stations, that there just aren't very many education reporters. But most education reporters who are in the mainstream, that is, they work for or maybe they're members of the Education Writers Association, they don't have to worry about, they write for their newspaper or their TV or whatever it is. That's the entity that's going and getting readers and viewers. They don't have to really worry about the responsibility. As a blogger, you sort of do have to take that, because if you're just writing and you don't then work to get people to read it, I mean, it's nice, I guess, that you get a chance to do some research or write about your opinions, but if nobody is reading it, then it seems rather less important than it would be if you were actually. So I'd say now that my blog is 5 or 6 years old, I have to spend less time, but in the opening years, I spent about 50% of my time researching and writing, and about 50% of my time building my audience. And so for people that want to get going with a blog or something like that, there's a whole nother part of this work.
Yes. You touch on so many good things. And I everything that you're saying, like, I'm totally, because I think that was one of the reasons that we started the Educators Room, because we felt like there was so many stories in education that don't get the proper attention from the news. And it's almost, education is the cornerstone of our society, but yet we regulate it to the corner unless some hot topic comes up, and then we splash it on the headlines, and then we're done until the next hot topic. So I wanted to talk about the kind of the warring sides of education reporter versus blogger, because the same thing is happening in education with teachers who teach at regular public schools opposed to teachers who teach in charter schools. And many of us are saying that, yes, you're a teacher, but you're not getting the type of children that we get, because you guys have different safe holds sometimes that will keep certain teachers out. So can you talk a little bit about, I guess, why the tension, and do you think that blogging has taken over the journalism world? Because I'm more apt to go to bloggers opposed to going to news sources. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yep. Both of those issues I think are really important, and that is what I found is that teachers as a whole it's not that they don't want to know about stuff, but this idea that, you show up at whatever 7 in the morning and by 2 in the afternoon, you're done with your job and you just go home and kick your feet up and don't care about anything, obviously is so far from the truth that what I find is that many teachers don't actually have a lot of the details about the environment, the policy environment working around them. So, I mean, even still, as I said, I've been doing this for quite a while now, and I continually run into teachers who say, oh, I didn't know anything about that, or I didn't know anything about this. And it's not that they don't care, but that it's a pretty hectic job. And plus, they have their own lives and lots going on, and they're a good example of what happens to the public, and that is, if you can't get your news, if you really don't get accurate news from the mass media, then you don't get news much at all. And so I think bloggers have really filled in a role for different subgroups who want to know about their particular field. So as these 250 bloggers around the country that I work with, I think they probably are a much bigger force for educating and updating teachers than the mass media, because they're writing about the very issues that teachers and parents and school board members and others care about. And over time, people get more knowledgeable about, oh, I can go to that website and I'll find out a lot of good information. And then because we try to share it among ourselves, and often if I see an article that I thought was really good by another blogger, I might repost it, or certainly Diane Ravitch will repost it. And so we're getting a far greater reach than we otherwise would. And I think we're having more of an impact now than we ever have, and more of an impact than the mass media, because they're just not covering it. And the examples for the longest time, for example, with the charter schools, they were just saying, hey, we do a better job. And people believe that rhetoric. One of the things you quickly learn as a politician is that if you say something persuasive, if you say it in a persuasive enough way, and you say it enough times, there are a lot of people that will believe it. And
hello?
Yeah.
Hold on.
We have a little bit of
Also,
Yeah, hold on.
we're giving just a few additional minutes that students are in second period and that you take attendance before we dismiss fourth floor to go to lunch. It's very important that you take attendance before dismissing to lunch. So we'll give you time to do that.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. So they would just say it, and they'd say our test scores are better, we do better, our teachers are better, or whatever it was. And there was really no mechanism to challenge that, because it takes some research, and most reporters just don't have the time. Either there isn't even an education reporter, or there's somebody, but they don't have the time to do the digging. And so what I found is, when it comes to real investigative reporting, the only place it's really being done for the most part is by bloggers. And I find that to be some of the funnest part of the job, is just to report on what's happening. So what's the budget, what laws have taken place, what those laws mean. Some of that is standard reporting. And then, as I said, a good chunk of the time is spent doing some real research, which I just really find is a way to, for me, it's very rewarding, but I think for my readers, it is as well. I mean, we have just as an example, two different charter school here in my state, we found that the people in charge had doctored their own resumes. In one case, he claimed to be a doctor. Well, in actually two different cases, they claimed to be PhDs or EDs, and they weren't. The research that I had done, or that we had done, about some of the legal issues and ethical issues, one of them, soon after we got done reporting on it, then the mainstream media picked it up. And as soon as the mainstream media picked it up, the FBI came in and raided the charter school, and the leadership had to resign, and there are still charges pending. And another one, the mainstream media picked it up, and it was a person who was trying to become a superintendent of schools. And once we were able to identify his problems, he would then withdrew. So those are cases where, and I would say, the most rewarding is where the mainstream media suddenly says, oh, there's a story that we should have known about, but we didn't. So we're going to take it from them. And so people will say, they stole your story. And my feeling is that's the ultimate compliment, is when they actually do a story that you've been working on.
So there was a story that I read. It's been a couple of months. There was somebody, I don't know if it was the Educator, I don't know who it was, but somebody reported about Detroit spending millions of dollars on, what's his name? He's the big consultant, Marzano. Marzano came into the district, and they spent like $10 million. I don't know the number, but it was a crazy amount, when Detroit is literally in the midst of, in schools, teachers are having water from the ceiling. And I remember reading about it on a blog and thinking, my God, there was a lot of work that went into writing this article. And not only that, it made the news stations in Detroit look a little bit dishonest, because these are things that she just found out from public record, and that she reported on. So I guess one of the things that we're trying to do, and we talk about ethics, that's what we talked about this past week, is as a blogger and as a journalist, there are certain ethical things that you have to make sure you do. I know you've talked about research and, if you really want to get into the good investigative reporting, but what are some other things that you would tell aspiring teachers who either want to be bloggers, investigative bloggers, or they want to be journalists in another life? What would you tell them? What are some ethical things that nobody tells you about that you
Right.
consider as somebody who reports on education?
Yep. And I've sort of learned, I would say, learning by doing. There are a number of the bloggers who have been around, they all got started, the longer term ones all got started about the same time. It's interesting. We all started to notice that, wait a minute, something is very wrong here with the whole idea of education reform. And it was in that about 2010 period, and then Diane came out with Reign of Error, and that's how a number of us got connected with each other. And so we've been spending a lot of time doing exactly what you just said, is sort of talking to people about how rewarding it is, but it's also a lot of work. And what I say to people is, it doesn't have to consume you. On the other hand, if you really enjoy it, it can. I warn folks that, like journalism, this isn't the way to go if you want to suddenly make a lot of money. This is the way to go if you want to have an impact and make a difference. Right. But none of us bloggers have yet quite figured out how you make any real money at it. So most people have other jobs. They're either retired, or they're teachers, or they work at universities, or they're for whatever reason, moms or dads that have time on their hands now that the kids are going back. And so the first number one issue I've learned is the best thing to do is just to start writing. Because by writing, I look at my first one 6 years ago, and I have to say it's embarrassing, because you learn by doing. And so the number one thing is just learn and practice writing. And the easiest way to do that is to find interesting news stories about education, and rewrite those stories and put them up on a blog. And that is, you don't have to do a bunch of research. That can come as you get more knowledgeable about techniques. But rewriting somebody else's news story, and the ethics of it is that you have to cite it. So today, for example, I said, I did a quick little post about, and if people go to my website, it's Jonathan Pelto, JONATHAN, Pelto, PELTO.com, and you'll see the wide variety of kinds of pieces that I write. But today's was a piece that was just a knockoff of something that I saw in one of the newspapers in the state. It's called the Connecticut Post, and it was an interesting story that had a lot more backstory, and I could have spent the whole day doing it, because it was some political shenanigans and somebody getting a job that's not qualified for the job. But the reason that they're so interesting is that they did, as they were the mayor of the city of Bridgeport, and they had done tremendous damage to the public schools, and now they've landed on their feet and have a big cushy $175,000 job. But I didn't have time to do too much, so instead what I did was I took the story and I just basically rewrote it.
And I'm reading it now. Yeah.
And I try to keep my stories somewhere between at the top end 1,500 words, and at the bottom end about 500 words. When you get to the next step, and the next step is learning to send in commentary pieces to newspapers or magazines, and that's one of the ways they're always looking for content. It's obviously a little bit harder to get into a big newspaper or big magazine than it is smaller ones. But what we find, almost all of our bloggers, maybe it's once a month, a couple times a year, once a week, they send in an article. There's also websites, even if you don't want to start your own blog, that automatically accept stories, something like the Huffington Post. People think of that as being a news blog, and it is, but it also has a whole section in it that you can just load your story on, and they want stories that are no more than about 1,500 words. So
go ahead.
So the first thing I would say is just start writing, because that will help you really learn how to write for journalism, and how that borderline between what's called journalistic writing, which is not persuasive, it's just fact-based, and persuasive writing. And because I'm a blogger, I feel more comfortable. I actually, as I said at the beginning, I don't believe that there are two kinds. I believe that there's just one kind of journalism, and it's the same as CNN and Fox News and what I do. It's just degrees on a spectrum of how honest we are. with our readers about where we stand. That the news people say, "Oh, we're not biased," and then you watch it and you say, "Come on, how can you possibly say you're not biased?" So I'm upfront. I'm biased. I'm pro-education. I'm pro-teacher. I don't believe in charter schools, but I also, when I quote a source, whenever possible, I use their name. When I use our news article, I link to the article. If I'm trying to break a story, I usually try to have two sources, like reporters do. I don't make stuff up. I fact check things. I use a lot of statistics, and when I get them, I say where I got them. But that I consider myself in the job of educating people about the news, just as a news person is about educating the news. So first and foremost, practice writing. And then the second is start to explore some of this different kinds of research, because there's so many things that you can do. One of the ways that I often got started is I just go to the State Department of Education website and I look at what's been posted recently, and that's a good starting point for doing a story, because not very many people read the State Department of Education or the Federal Department of Education websites, and you can get stories there that all of the information is there, or at least the beginning of the information. And so you learn how to do research by simply going to a website that already has information that nobody else has. And even though it may be public, not a lot of people go there. And the same is true for the education advocacy groups, both for charter schools and against charter schools. They're always putting up reports and studies and press releases. And oftentimes I'll go and take a look, and if it's something that I agree with, I'll say, okay, well, here's an interesting report, and here's what's interesting about it, and by the way, here's a link to the report. Or if it's on the other side and they say something and I can tell it's just not the whole story, and now that I've learned more about how to do the research, I can prove it's not the whole story, then that's a great story, because you take that and you say, this is what they said, but in fact it's not true for the following reasons. So that's a good way to sort of build into how to be an effective blogger.
And I think that's such a good point, because when you talk about the research, and there's so much, because if you think about it, in just one school district, there's so much research being pulled from just one school district, whether large or small, and you can take a piece and write a story about it. And so this week, our writers, they learned about ethics, but they're also trying to start with, they're going to have a focus for the summer. So for the summer, they're going to have one piece out of education that they want to continually report on, and then have a end of the fellowship where they present all of their research and everything they found and whatever spin they're going to take on it. So I think it's so interesting, because I would never have thought to, other than if someone tells me, to go to the State Department website, pull some of their research and see where I can glean from it. Especially when you're looking at reporting for charter schools, seeing exactly how many of the students who are in charter schools come from middle class families, and how does that impact their test scores, and who is left in the neighborhood. Those are things that, we're trying to talk to our writers about. But I think that's a really good point on what you made, because a lot of people will say, well, I'm nervous, I don't know how to do it, I'm having these I'm very apprehensive about it. But the main thing is to write, and to consistently write, because then you find yourself getting better, because you'll start reading other people's blogs, you'll start to research on your own, and you'll start to have your own thoughts and go from there. What are some of the challenges? Because the educator's room consumes me. It consumes when I wake up, when I go to sleep, it consumes me. But what are some of the other challenges that you see as somebody who is, I would say, I know there's a distinction, or people want there to be a distinction, but somebody who reports on education, what are some of the challenges that you've seen? The money is not good. Hopefully we can change some of that. But what are some other things that you see going on?
Well, the barriers to it is oftentimes, I think, people bite off more than they can chew, or they think that it's a bigger thing than it really is. I blog pretty much every day, and that's for a variety of reasons that it worked out for me to do that. there's nothing wrong with blogging once a week. We have a couple of our bloggers who they blog on Facebook. They just write a 200 or 500 word article, and they just put it on Facebook. Other people, they write a commentary piece and they send it in to the local paper, that may be the Des Moines newspaper in Des Moines, Iowa, and they'd maybe do that 4 or 5 times a year, and I consider them to be education reporters. And others go to meetings, somebody like Educator, who's certainly well worth reading. I mean, she does it virtually full time, and she has, some of us have different styles. Hers is pretending to be one of the reformers, and so she writes her things, and they're really funny, but they're not, I mean, they're so funny, and yet at the same time they're kind of terrifying. So she's got a persona that she uses that guides her. Mine is much more, I like being fairly caustic, and so I write pieces that are a lot harder hitting. But we have other people that write just very matter of fact. This is what happened. I went to the board meeting. This is what they debated about. Or I searched this company and I found out about it, and here's what I found out. And so the challenge is not to get overwhelmed. Not only is there no money in it, but not to say, okay, I've got to do everything. And that can often be hard because you see so many things that you want to write about or you want to tell people about. There was a study the other day that, and I did a piece with another blogger. Together we did it, that there's, on the Common Core testing, there's the SBAC and the PARC, the two different tests that are being used. And a study came out of Massachusetts that showed that it had no correlation to how well a kid does in college, and yet it was sold for the sole purpose. The whole reason we wanted to do this massive No Child Left Untested was that we were going to be able to tell them whether they were college and career ready, because the higher the score, the more they said that they would be college and career ready. And what most experts have said is that grade point averages are actually a much better indicator, even though grading is different in all different kinds of schools. When you take all grading versus all testing, the likelihood of success in college is better if you look at how did they do with their grades and how did they do with their tests, which of course makes perfect sense to a teacher, but not to these education reformers. So this story, we saw the story, this study came out. And what was interesting is we decided we were going to write about this study, and we were rushing because we wanted to be one of the first ones to write. We published it, and it was our story that Diane and everybody else picked up because nobody else had even bothered to read this study, or very few people. So the biggest challenge is to decide, when something is happening, you run into something, can you take the time, even if it's just a few hours or a day, to do some research and write it up? Because sometimes you're writing what has already been written, and sometimes you trip into stuff. I'll give you one other example, and I'll give you a few places that you can do research. But one, this department, your State Department of Education usually has a pretty good database of different demographics. And one of the things that most states collect, but nobody really looks at, is suspension rates. So on our, what I managed to find, and in my state, the state maintains all the data and it's supposed to be public and it's there. It's hard to find, and you have to oftentimes hunt for it or find somebody who knows about it. What I usually do is, if I'm going to do something about special education, I try to find a special education teacher and say, what reports do you have to submit? What happens to those reports? Because then eventually I can find them. So what I found when I did the suspension is I listed all of the schools by the total number of suspensions in school and out of school. And I found that when you rank order them, let's say of the top 50 schools, all of the worst offenders were charter schools. No, and it's just sitting there, but nobody had looked at it. And now it's so obvious. We've heard it. Parents complain about it. Children complain about it. And that is, how do they get rid of? First off, if the things that charter schools discriminate most on is not providing special education services, and that way they can say to students, well, we'd be happy to if you came here, but we don't have the services that you need. So go back to the public school and drop their test scores. Don't drop our test scores.
Yes.
The second is in most charter schools, there are always examples on the other side, but most charter schools also refuse to provide sufficient English language learning. And you can find that, for example, by you go and every school nowadays, it's mandated that there be a school profile. And on that school profile, it will have the number of African American, the number of Latino, the number of English language learners, the number of students who go home to households that don't speak English, the number of students who are special ed, the number that have autism. All of those statistics are just sitting there on the school profile. The only thing the media looks at is many states now just they've graded the school A through F. They don't even read the report. So you go and you read a report on a charter school and you find out the average in my state is they have less than half the number of special ed students. And when they do take special ed students, they're not taking the ones that really require services. And what's so interesting in Connecticut and most other states, the only thing that they're reimbursed at full rate or nearly full rate is special ed. In Connecticut, you get a $11,000 grant to be a charter school, $11,000 per pupil, plus 100% reimbursement for your special education costs. The fact that they don't educate special ed is not because they don't have the money. They don't want to. They could easily hire the special ed teachers and the state would pay for it. They just don't want to. So that's an interesting thing then that I can write about because I can say, look, I mean, these schools just don't want it, and here's the statistic. So a lot of times, as I said, I get my information. So they have listed the suspension rates, and all you have to do is you have to go and pull the report and you look at the suspension rate for this school versus the suspension rate for that school, and you see their technique. So they don't want to take special ed students, they don't want to take English language learners, and when they take kids that have behavioral issues or even not behavioral issues that as we would define them in public schools, we would just call them, you know, rambunctious kids that need some help. They want to get rid of those kids. So there's a charter school in our capital city that had about 800 students and has 2,600 suspensions. That is that every kid or a big chunk of the kids are suspended for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, which is an effective way because if the parents are working or the parents aren't there in the household or there are other issues and they can't go and deal with it every day, they just pull their kid out and drop them into the public schools. And so again, you know, how do charter schools get the kind of test scores? Well, it's easy. They get rid of all of the kids that might lower their test scores.
Yeah.
So on research, I find again that the state is a really useful thing. Another major source of information are what's called IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, Form 990. And anybody who's listening, you could Google IRS 990, and what you'll come up with is there are a number of websites that provide these for free. And IRS 990 is the annual report that every nonprofit has to submit.
And you can see who's on their board and who's contributed, and it's very interesting.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a charter, you know, let's say there's a charter school or there's a new organization in town that suddenly is fighting, quote unquote, for kids. If you pull their 990, and you can usually pull 3 years without any charge, and then if you want older ones, they charge you a little bit. But there's one called Guide Star, and there's one called there's about 10 of these different sites. I may just write a story about what I find on their 990. How much does their CEO make? How many people are there that are paid more than $100,000? Where did they get their money? What consultants did they hire? Who's on their board? And so that's an easy story. It's true investigative journalism. Nobody else is going to do that story if you don't. And it's a way to learn how that form works, what information, little by little, you learn about, you know, what information isn't on there or should be on there. Oftentimes I'll find that it looks to me like they've doctored the information, and you know, I'm not in a position to be able to prove it, but I can say that looks like they're not reporting correctly. And I've even sent over reports to the IRS saying, you know, I was looking at this report and it raises very serious questions about whether they're following the law. And I don't know how many of them they followed up on, but it gives me a chance to feel like, you know, I'm starting to make a difference.
Yeah.
Another area that you can get information if they're a for-profit company, the same kinds of information is what's called the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. So a charter school company like the KIPP charter school company, they will have a 990, but the K-12 is a for-profit company. There you have to go to the Securities and Exchange Commission. But again, to report all kinds of stuff, and most get reported on by the media. So you can make a real difference by doing that. And then the third area that I do a lot of my research on is campaign finance reports. And you go to the state, usually it's the Secretary of State or the Campaign Finance Division, and you can look up names, and even the people that are participating today should just pick a state or their own state, go and look up. And I would say I'm working on some long research projects now, but you look up somebody like Michael Bloomberg and you find out that he's dumped hundreds of thousands of dollars, not only in New York and in California and in Oregon and in Louisiana and in Minnesota. I was doing a story today, I've been working on a story on Nevada, and there's a bunch of Bloomberg money that's shown up in Nevada. Now, most of that has never been reported on, but what you can find it pretty easily by just going to the state's campaign finance website. So every time you do that, you learn a little bit more about how to do research, or maybe you don't, and you know, it's frustrating because you can't find it. And I'll pick up the phone, or I'll write a letter to the place and say, how do you find out? How do I do searches? Many of them have little tutorials on them that will teach you how to use that website. But I find that, you know, the most fun is when you're doing your own investigative research, and so it's a lot easier than people realize. Again, as long as you keep it in small bites and not try to say, I'm gonna research the whole world when it comes to X or Y.
And that's so true. And you know, it's so interesting to hear about all of this, because a lot of the information is just out there. It just takes us to do it. And I think with our fellows right now, they're not feeling very, they're not feeling confident, because as a teacher, you're not told that, and this is one of the reasons that I started the Educator's Room, you're not told that you have an expertise and that you can use your expertise and your knowledge of schools to change. And I think that's one of the hardest things that we as teachers have to kind of get over. And we have to say, you know, I know enough to make some change. So whether it's starting a blog, whether it's applying to be an education reporter or going back to school, or, you know, these are things that can happen. And I think, you know, even though the face of journalism is changing, because like you said, you know, even if you go to CNN, MSNBC, the Young Turks, you know, all these different websites, people's opinions are coming through, and it's no longer, I mean, it's very evident, especially in this election year. You know, we have news stations that are very lenient towards Hillary Clinton, or very lenient towards Donald Trump, or very lenient towards Bernie Sanders. So I think that the face of journalism is changing a bit. So this upcoming week, we are having, we're going to have our participants to start to write a personal reflection piece, kind of why they wanted to jump into this area and how they feel like their knowledge can help change the face of education. And it's a lofty goal, but for somebody who has written, because we started the Educator's Room in 2012, it's been 4 years, but it's one of those things that I feel like in our small part of the universe, we've done a little bit of change, and it's been for the good of the group. So what would you charge? Because you've given us so much good information, and you guys, if you haven't, please go to his website, Jonathan Pelto, and I'll put it at the bottom of the screen so you guys can just click through. But what charge would you give them this upcoming week as they work on their personal reflections, and as they start to think that, hey, you know, maybe I don't want to work for a large newspaper that tells me what to write? Because the reality is, when you have your own blog, you kind of are like Shirley Chisholm. You're unbought, unsold. You can write about what you want. You know, I can. And
exactly. And which is what makes it so nice, is that you can, when you see something and you say, you know, I think people should know more about that, you can then actually write about it and people will know more about it. So it's one of the few times where, other than, you know, just talking among your friends, that you have a chance to to make that kind of difference. And, you know, one of the things I'd say as you think about that idea of, you know, what's a charge, that there are going to be issues that if you write about, you know, and you're staying in the teaching profession or your job, it could be problematic. And we have had bloggers who have gotten into trouble. We have one very outspoken, and his school district has really complained, and it's not really clear what. It's a clash between freedom of speech and saying things that the school district is going to believe undermines them. And so whether I think that in the end, push comes to shove, there's not a lot that they can do to quiet him down. On the other hand, they can certainly make his life difficult. And I know that a number of bloggers want to say, look, for now, I got to stay as a teacher. I've got to, you know, I do this or that, and I can't afford to lose that. And so I would say that the personal narrative is an excellent one to start with, but I'd also pick an issue that is very different from anything that you're dealing with at the moment, and learn a little bit about it and write up a 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 word essay that says, if I wanted to explain to somebody about this issue, and if not this week, then, you know, maybe it's next week you do it,
right.
That is something that in no way affects you. It is based in part on your expertise that you get this issue, but it's not affecting your district, so that you can hold it as an example of how do you write about an education issue, maybe even one that you know a whole lot about, but not put it in just your district so that it causes angst or problem. So let's think of a quick example would be, well, behavioral issues is a perfect one, since a lot of teachers are dealing with that all the time. And the idea that you would just you'd suspend the kid over and over and over again until their parents pulled them out is not only an anathema. I mean, that's obviously teachers have a role of supporting, not punishing kids, but it's one of the real breaking issues, because it's the Black Lives Matter issue, it's the discrimination issue, it's the way in this society, you know, if we had Donald Trump saying, we just won't allow Muslims in, or we'll throw out all of the Mexicans, these simplistic ideas that somehow, okay, well, we'll just throw out all the troubled kids. So if you were to write a little essay about, you know, not naming names, but, you know, an example of some experience that you've had where you did get the kid focused and the kid did do better, and then you go and get a few statistics like the suspension rate for a city nearby or the suspension rate for a state nearby, and you do a little piece that says in a state nearby or a city nearby, the average suspension rate is X, and according to the data, with with African-American boys, it's Y, and we're losing those people. And here's an experience that I found where we were able to keep a child like that in the classroom interested. So then you've created something that has your expertise, it has some statistics, it's educational, it doesn't have, you haven't named their district, so you haven't gone after your own administrators for doing that.
For the exact same thing.
That's right, for doing the same thing, but you put in people's minds, hey, wait a minute, that makes sense. So I would, again, pick something that is both in your comfort zone, but outside of what you're talking about, and that would force you to do a little bit of research. And even if you don't have time to do research, just Google high school suspension rates or kindergarten suspension rates. You'll find an article that you could then use that says, here's an article from the Minneapolis Tribune where they found very high suspension rates for kindergartners. And you can say, you know, that it's absurd that that's allowed to take place because blah, blah, blah. Or maybe not. Maybe you feel like this is something that, you know, needs to happen to start putting boundaries into place. So I think that's how I would give a charge to something like that.
and that's such a great way to segue into that. You have so much knowledge. I'm so impressed by and I'm just so impressed because, you know, I become so engrossed with the Educator's Room that I don't get a chance sometimes to read some of the other blogs. And so I was just reading your blog as I was going through, and I was like, wow, this is such great information. Like, yes. So we thank you.
Almost all of those bloggers would love to talk with somebody. I mean, you know, we are sort of it's a lonely business. I mean, it's you and your computer, and then a few and then people who comment don't necessarily reflect all of the readers, and sometimes the comments are not nice, and that's another charge that I would say, if not this week, while this project is going on, find a blog, read something that you like, send it a note to the blogger and ask them a question, or see if they would give you advice, or maybe even they do a talk on the phone, or text back and forth, and see if you can find a blogger or two who would be interested in either mentoring you or at least giving you advice, or who you could turn to, because I think the vast majority of these bloggers would just love it if somebody would pay attention to them too.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. And the Educators Room, it started with me. It was just me. I was just upset about some things in my district, and I started writing about them. And then from that, I brought in other people, other teachers who felt the same way. And 4 years later, we have 30 people that write for us. And I say us, me, and that write once a week, twice a week, 3 times a month. It just depends on their schedule. So we have a lot to talk about once we end this phone call. But guys, I'm going to put his website. The charge this week, in addition to what he told you, I also want you to go to his website, and I want you to look at it, because it has lots of good research, lots of good education reporting. It's great. So I want you to go. The website will be underneath here. Leave him a comment. Do you have an email address or a way they can contact you if they have additional questions, or if you guys see that you want to write for him? Just how do they get in contact with you?
So actually, if they go to the website, there's a little tab up at the top that says contact, and has my email right there, and that's probably the easiest way, is through jonathanpelto.com.
Okay.
And particularly anybody who's thinking about setting up a blog, or even just writing. I mean, this network that we have, we're open. There's no editorial control. We're just here to help each other. So if there are people that are starting to move into that realm, they should certainly get in contact with me, and I will get them some information about that and try to help them out in any way that I can. It's the most thing is to have fun with it, and to feel that it's an opportunity to be heard. And the biggest problem I think we have with what's happened to the mass media is that it's very hard to learn the truth, because everything is coming from, I read that so 90% of the media is owned by 6 companies.
It's very true.
And that's a very dangerous world. That creates the dangerous, one of the things that creates the dangerous world in which we live in. So even, I mean, you don't want to just write and have nobody read it. On the other hand, there are so many people that are searching for information, and that if you're writing and you're communicating information, that's probably the single best thing that we can do to try to keep evil at bay, is just be out there telling the truth, which is why, I mean, that's what you've been doing with your website, and with this program, is giving people the tools to speak the truth. So just do that and see where it goes.
Yeah. And I think that, well, for interest time, I'm going to get off, but we'll talk after this. But you guys, you'll have a link. Please use it to contact him. And I will just say, for anybody who's watching this, who's not in the fellowship, is that in order, I saw a quote the other day, and it basically said, our news is fake, our food is fake, just as people. And so, you, at what point do you start to realize the truth? And I really feel like that blogging is that way. And it's that way for us to kind of figure out, with all the noise that's going around, all the white noise that's on the news and on the radio, when you have a website that is not backed by a big funder, you're getting the raw truth, because you have nothing to lose. And what I've found for a lot of the writers, and even myself, even when you work in these districts, when you are writing, it doesn't make you feel invincible, because that's not really a good thing, but it does make you say that, I know what you're doing is wrong, and I know it because of this, and I'm not going to stand for it. So guys, please take a second, check out his website, and join us next week as we have our second masterclass. Remember, every week we're going to bring you guys some education reporters who are unafraid to tell you guys behind the scenes what goes on, how they write, advice, and all the good stuff. We'll see you next week. And just hold for 1 second.